Many of the lochs and ponds of Scotland feature tales of Kelpies, and unlike the gentle Selkies of Scottish lore who we have met before, Kelpies are altogether far more dangerous beings. But what are they and why are they so dangerous? Let's find out in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are finally into March and this month we're going to be focusing on water folklore. Now, we have done water mythology before, which was I think 2019 when we looked at the likes of Selkies and mermaids and sirens and what have you. But this time we're going to be looking more at the legends and myths and creatures and so on associated with rivers, lakes, waterfalls and also anything else that happens to come up. So this week's content is going to be the Kelpie, and the Kelpie is quite an interesting figure from Scottish folklore, and there are also some similar creatures that do appear in Scandinavian folklore as well, although I am going to be focusing on the Scottish version in this particular episode. So without any further ado, let's go and meet one. So we are, as I say, getting into the Kelpie, and most accounts do describe the Kelpie as taking the form of a horse. And essentially what they do is they lure bystanders to climb onto their back and then plunge headlong into the nearest body of water to drown their victim. And unfortunately the victim can't just clamber free because they become magically stuck to the Kelpie's back, unable to free themselves. Now, I do say that they take the form of horses because Kelpies are something of a shapeshifter, and they do usually take equine form in stories, although some tales do have them take on human form. And when they take on human form, they're occasionally described as a human with hooves, although in all fairness, I think you'd probably imagine that people might have actually noticed that. Most people consider Kelpies to be some kind of fairies, other people consider them to be nature spirits, and Catherine Briggs equated the Kelpie to other nature spirits such as Peg Powler in the Tees, the Glacigs of Scotland, the Brownman of the Moors and the mighty Cailleach of the mountains. And if you're interested in the Cailleach, the February exclusive episode of Fabulous Folklore available to Patreon supporters was on the Cailleach, so you can find out more about her by becoming a supporter. But anyway, back to Kelpies. When Kelpies appear in male form, they're said to be very hairy and they jump out at lone travellers on deserted roads to crush them to death. Female Kelpies, on the other hand, are a little bit more seductive and they like to take the form of beautiful women and lure men to their deaths in the water. So when you do find artwork of them, they're nearly always sort of portrayed as these kind of come-hither maidens sitting on rocks trying to lure men towards them. There's a very famous one by Thomas Millie Dow, and then there's another one which is equally famous by Herbert James Draper, and in both of them the focus on the female Kelpie is this almost hypersexual seductive female figure. It is possible that Kelpies date to times when villagers appeased water gods with human sacrifices, and after a while the water gods may have become evil water horses. Now, given the traditional association of horses with power and white horses with fertility, it's unclear where the belief really came from because Kelpies are usually considered to be black horses, so it's a little bit of a strange one, but it could also feed into this Scandinavian folklore around a very similar figure. But it's one of those things where, as ever, it's quite difficult to trace where a belief comes from. And some people prefer to only use the term Kelpie since waterhorse can actually refer to a whole range of creatures. And because not all waterhorses are malevolent, this is where the confusion arises. So I'm referring to Kelpies as a specific type of waterhorse, not just waterhorses in general. So why are Kelpies so dangerous? Well, in horse form, Kelpies essentially enticed people to climb onto their back for a ride, only to drown them as soon as they possibly could. And they did like to target children in particular. So people learned to be quite wary of dark grey or black horses that appeared lost near lakes or rivers, and a dripping mane would often give Kelpies away. Some people thought that the noise of Kelpie's tail when it entered this water sounded like thunder, so therefore it made quite good sense to avoid rivers or lakes if you heard that. I would also say it's probably quite a good idea to avoid standing under any trees in case it actually was thunder. but howling or wailing also gave them away, because here they were actually warning of approaching storms. So this at least makes them quite a useful addition to the local community. Now, according to Lizanne Henderson, quoted in The Scotsman, the Kelpie reflects the phase of a coastal population that couldn't swim. So obviously, if you think about it, if you can't swim, anything that could potentially drag you out into the water would therefore become dangerous. So getting people to stay away from the water would be quite helpful. And Rowena at Rowena and Foxell agrees, noting that the Kelpie stories not only help to keep people away from dangerous water, it also helps to keep children in particular away from dangerous creatures. And they also warned young women not to trust handsome male strangers because they could be a Kelpie in disguise. Yet despite all of this, stories still persist of people who didn't heed warnings about Kelpies. And in an 1883 issue of the Folklore Journal, Walter Gregor relates a tale from Braco in Aberdeenshire about a pool that was the home of a Kelpie. And one evening the river nearby was in flood, and a man heading home realised that he couldn't cross the waters on his own. And he looks around thinking, oh my god, how am I going to cross this river, when he spots a horse peacefully grazing on the bank, and it didn't cross the man's mind that this might actually be a treacherous Kelpie. So instead, the man decides that the horse would make a wonderful way to cross the river. Surprisingly, the horse actually submitted and let him climb up onto its back, and as soon as he was settled, the Kelpie ran off into the water and dragged the man into the deepest part of the pool. So here he's bound to have known the folklore about this, but yet decides, nope, I need to cross the river, and this Kelpie allegedly then drags him to his death. So bearing this in mind, can you actually survive an encounter with a Kelpie? And actually the answer is yes. In some of the tales, simply striking the suspected Kelpie while it was in human form would then make it regain its horse form and run away. Otherwise, if you stole its bridle while it was in human form, you then gained mastery over it. And Kelpies apparently had the strength of 10 horses, so they would make quite good additions to the household if you could get hold of one. In some stories, women stole the bridles from male Kelpies, which then obviously forced them to retain their human form, but this basically had a similar effect to stealing a selkie skin, so if you stole a male Kelpie's bridle, you could then force him to marry you. It does sound extreme, and obviously it completely ignores any kind of ideas around consent, but like I always say in these cases, still preferable to using Tinder. Now, in some stories, if you actually cut off the Kelpie's bridle while it was in its horse form, it removed its source of power. And if you didn't return the bridle, the Kelpie would then die within a day. There are other variations of people cutting the bridle off and then making the Kelpie do things for it to give the bridle back and so on. So in these cases, humans could absolutely get power over the Kelpie simply by stealing its bridle. But as ever, stories vary from place to place. Now, you could also survive an encounter with the Kelpie in its equine form if you kept your wits about you. So a story related in an 1889 issue of the Folklore Journal examines the somewhat tricksy nature of the Kelpie. And in it, a man needs to cross a river to reach his dying wife at home, and he's obviously worried about who's going to look after his children and so on while he's not there. Now, unfortunately, a massive rainstorm has flooded the river and washed away the wooden bridge. So the man reaches this, sees he's unable to cross the river, and basically breaks down at the sight of it because he has no idea how he's going to get home. Another man approaches him and offers to carry him across the river, and the fact that his clothes are wet up to his armpits seems to convince our poor hero that this newcomer has some kind of weird means of crossing the river unharmed, if he's been able to cross up to his armpits and somehow still get out the other side, allegedly in one piece. So the apparently kind stranger carries our hero into the middle of the river, but at this point he then tries to throw him off into the raging torrent. Now our hero basically hangs on and he just will not let go of the Kelpie whatsoever, and they end up tumbling down the river, kind of like one over the other, until they reach the shallows near the bank. At this point, as soon as the man feels his feet touch the bottom, he actually lets go of the stranger and climbs out of the river, running away as fast as he can. So in this case, it does obviously negate that idea of the Kelpie's coat being able to keep you magnetically attached to it, and when they're in human form, according to this story, that's not the case. Anyway, absolutely enraged at losing his prey, the Kelpie tears a rock from the riverbed and throws it some 80 yards after the man. He does miss, I should point out, so the man does get away, so it's all very lovely. But from thence on, that particular rock was known as the Kelpie stone, and passers-by would add a stone beside it until the rocks formed a cairn. Eventually that was then broken up and used for building work, and the bridge was replaced by a stone one, so I can only imagine that the Kelpie pretty much lost any opportunity to do the same to other people. But it does basically show that you can, if you end up enticed by one, apparently let go of one, get rid of them, all that kind of thing. But it does really mean that you'd save a lot of bother if you just don't touch them at all. And because in most stories it's their magical hide that prevents you from getting free, and then they'll drag you to your death. That said, the Njörgl, the Shetland version of the Kelpie, was also apparently afraid of iron in common with many other supernatural creatures, so it's entirely possible that if you had some kind of iron about your person, you might be able to survive an encounter with them. And also I should point out that the ruined Vane Castle stands north of Forfar, and the sandstone near the bank bears a hoof imprint that many say it comes from a Kelpie, and it's dangerous to venture here at dawn or dusk, particularly if you hear it singing. Now, some people do actually believe that sightings of the Loch Ness Monster can be explained using Kelpie stories, and sightings date back to the 6th century when St Columba apparently defeated a monster in the area. Now, the Highlander James MacGregor took on the Kelpie in the early 19th century, cutting off his bridle, and the Kelpie tried to beg for its return before following MacGregor home. Now, when MacGregor got home, he couldn't actually just simply walk across the threshold of his house while carrying the bridle because he had a cross above the door, and this isn't the first story to link the Kelpie with demonic forces. But MacGregor wasn't going to be so easily put off, so he actually just dropped the bridle through a window before then walking through the door himself. Now, presumably the Kelpie died within the stated 24-hour period, but there are also stories of further tales that follow the bridle through the family, giving it healing powers throughout the ages. But it does just go to show that there are these legends of humans somehow getting the bridle off the Kelpie and then being able to exert power over it as a result. I do kind of think that the idea of the Loch Ness Monster as a Kelpie is an interesting one, but I also kind of think that it also doesn't necessarily work when you consider that a lot of the sightings of Nessie don't really match sightings of Kelpies, although it's still quite cool to have the two of them in the same place. Now, we couldn't really end a podcast episode about the Kelpies without mentioning the Kelpie Sculpture near Falkirk, and this is essentially, if you've never seen them, two 30-metre high sculptures made out of metal of two giant horse heads, and they essentially immortalised the Kelpie, as I say, near Falkirk, and designed by Andy Scott. They were installed in 2013 and opened to the public in 2014, and Scott specifically chose the form of horses to reference the legendary strength of the Kelpie. Now, as I say, they are 30 metres high, so they are the largest equine sculptures in the world, and not only do they reference the Kelpie, they also reflect Scotland's horse-powered industrial heritage as well. I am, however, going to assume that these Kelpies also come from the little bit more benevolent side of the family. Now, as with any other folklore story, you do get plenty of variations about Kelpies, and it makes it quite difficult to find any sense of truth. And in older sources, you tend to find that the tales dwell on the Kelpies in their human form, while later versions tend to focus on their horse form. And I think if you Google Kelpies now, a lot of the stuff you get about them is them in their horse form rather than them in their human form. But either way, the stories do seem to have served a purpose in their specific place and time, and we can still learn from them now. So obviously one lesson would be don't attempt to ride unattended horses, particularly if you don't know how to ride, but also you don't know whose horse it is, so maybe just leave it alone. And also, if you're thinking of crossing a raging torrent in a horse, think about the horse's welfare. I mean, that just doesn't seem like a good idea on any level. But another lesson would also be to avoid lonely stretches of water at dawn or dusk, and quite frankly, that's just really good life advice, whether you're dealing with Kelpies or not. But it is quite interesting how I do think that the Kelpie ultimately performs this role as a cautionary tale, as a lot of folklore does, because if you want to try and get people to not do something, which is going to be more effective? Telling them not to do the thing, or giving them some kind of reason why they shouldn't do the thing. And obviously, if you've got the choice between don't go in the water because you don't know how to swim versus don't go near the water because a Kelpie might drag you off to your doom, it's that one kind of sticks a little bit better. So I do think that that is probably the role that the Kelpie has played throughout time, unless of course they are still patrolling lonely stretches of water at dawn or dusk. So I hope that you enjoyed this week's episode. Like I say, we are going to have a look at other things more generally about waterfalls, rivers and lakes. If you do have any specific requests, please do let me know. Obviously, I'd be happy to put them in. But I just thought it would be quite cool to have a look at these kind of watery based things, particularly from the British Isles, although we will be having a look at other stories from other parts of Europe, including Iceland and Italy, in the next few episodes. So I do hope that you come back and enjoy those as well. As always, if you do enjoy the podcast, then leaving a review is marvellous, because it does then tell the podcast platforms to go and show this to other people so they can join in the Fabulous Folklore fun as well. Tell a friend, pass it on to someone who you think might enjoy this as well. And if you would like to support the show in other ways, obviously you do have the Patreon support, where you can support the show from as little as 75p a month, or you can also buy me a coffee on coffee.com as well, and basically that goes towards my costs in producing and hosting and all that kind of jazz, so that Fabulous Folklore actually happens. But anyway, without any further ado, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you next week when we have a look at river folklore. So until then, stay safe and cheerio. Well, thank you for listening, and thanks for visiting Fabulous Folklore. I hope you enjoyed your stay. If you did, why not consider subscribing in your podcast app of choice? If you enjoy the show, why not leave me a review and help other listeners to find it as well? And if you'd like bonus exclusive episodes of the podcast, then why not support me on Patreon? It does help me to keep the show going, and it means that you get a little bit extra every month as well. And you can find all of the necessary links in the show notes below. So without any further ado, I will bid you adieu, and I hope that you have safe travels wherever you're going on to next.